Pioneering solutions, transformational technology, and inspirational leaders. I'm your host, Connor Sherman, and this is the Confident Defense Podcast. Good afternoon, everybody. We are super stoked to do a live stream with none other than James Stanley and Henry Chiappetta. Nope, got that one wrong. James Chiappetta and Henry Stanley. So, guys, I really stoked this conversation. We've been talking a lot off camera for like a year about how agile methodologies can influence and change how security teams function and operate, what it means to be a leader in driving an effective security program in product-led companies. And so finally, this conversation has culminated, and here we are live on LinkedIn. So, Henry, welcome to the show, mate.
Thanks so much for having me, Connor. I'm excited to mix it up with you guys. A lot of interesting conversations. Happy to take them to the next level.
Yeah, it's like one of those things where you think about it, it's like, well, what is Agile? Like, do we really, when you think about Agile, it's like just how we ship software differently than we did beforehand. But there really is this complete unpacking and reframing of prioritization, customer feedback, all these things that security is kind of terrible at. It's like we go into these things, we're like, nope, we have this large monolithic framework. And if we check these boxes and we do these things, then most of the world thinks you've achieved this level of security. But we just have to know that is just not true. So I think I just kind of want to start with a super broad opening about like, why is Agile needed in security? And then we'll just kind of move the conversation. I know you've got some strong opinions on like what it means to be a full stack leader, and we'll definitely make sure we have time to cover that today too.
Sure. Yeah. Amazing. So I guess if we start off with like the thesis behind like why is Agile needed in security, we should talk about like what is Agile in the first place. I think there's a lot of preloaded, just heavy misconceptions around Agile as a methodology, Agile as a mindset, Agile as a framework. So just first and foremost, Agile does not equal any specific framework or methodology. Agile is simply just a mindset, a way of thinking and approaching problems in a product-led setting. So if you look at, a lot of the misconceptions out there, people think immediately Scrum. Like, oh, you want to do Agile, that means you want to do Scrum, you want to do safe, scaled Agile framework, you want to throw a lot of process at this probably not so process needing problem, and it turns people off. But if you kind of walk it back and sort of unpack where it began and kind of why it's important, I think you'll find people are a lot more receptive to those ways of thinking. And in fact, they already do a lot of these things. It's just putting a verbiage on kind of what they're already instinctively doing. So, I mean, fundamentally, if you go back and look at the Agile Manifesto, which was drawn up, several decades ago at this point, it comes down to 4 basic tenets. We're focusing on individuals and interactions over process and tools, working software over documentation, customer collaboration over explicit contract negotiation, and responding to change over following an explicit plan. So if you unpack each of those things, I think that there's actually a lot of value in applying those concepts to a security setting. I know that, James, when you and I were working together, we had to figure out what is the right way to establish kind of a cultural framework around how we approach problem solving so that we can get the right things done at the right time. And if you kind of look at each of those, principles in line, I mean, you'll find that a lot of what security needs to do to manage risk proactively and reactively comes down to being able to get the right people in the right room at the right time to solve the problem at hand versus necessarily checking off a whole bunch of boxes or a predefined set of requirements in a particular problem space. So what is the best way of getting people in a room quickly to make decisions about how to either develop something new or respond to something that's rapidly evolving? You come down to those 4 tenets. You focus on quick decision-making through collaboration, individual interactions over, kind of heavyweight process, working demonstrable, provable data or software over explicit documentation, and you focus heavily on that collaboration piece in there. So when you approach it from the thematic level, I think there's a lot that you would want to unpack as part of a security program there.
See, here's what I think is really interesting about those thematic components here. You said it like each one of those really touches on having the right people in the room. There's a level of humility that comes with this to say, if we're going to go solve this problem, there isn't one person in the room who needs to solve this problem. Like, we're not going to get there unless we're all a component of that. And like this is like one of the things I think is thematic that comes up in a lot of the interviews that we do on the podcast. And if you think about like what the whole purpose of this podcast is, it's to help illuminate how do we win at this infinite game of cybersecurity, right? There is no end date to this game of security. So if anyone is to arrive and saying like, I've got the problem, I've got the solution, like you're wrong, right? You can't possibly have it. So I really like this idea of Agile being a forcing function that says we're going to prioritize these themes, and one of them being having this collaborative effort of getting the right people in the room.
Yeah. I think if you start with that assumption that there's no end to security, you got to always be more secure. I mean, I think everyone understands that, but when you talk about what needs to happen with a given amount of resources in a given amount of time, it's often really hard to balance all of the possible things that you could do to burn down the risk that the organization is facing. And I think even getting to the place where you can have a conversation around prioritization has to start from a place of compassion and empathy for what everyone is trying to solve for, and why we're even all focusing on the same problem, which comes back to what you were saying before about, the prioritization and using those kind of mindsets at least to get folks talking about these things.
So James, I want to get your perspective on this.
Yeah.
What are some of the things that you've found worked and with this?
Yeah, so I've actually broken this down before, and I think that when it comes down to, like, let me just try to paint a quick visualization, right? Like if you have trust at the center of everything, right? On one side, you have organization and like execution. And then on the other side, you have culture and enablement. And there's kind of this figure eight shape, right? Or infinity sign. It's this kind of virtuous cycle. And you really, if you have, this adoption of, security, and, the Agile methodology and this mindset of like, I'm bringing security to the table is not necessarily a blocker, but a way that will enable people, right? You're trying to meet the situation, what Henry was trying to say, with tools and tactics and techniques and things that will not necessarily profoundly change things up front, but over a long duration of time, with investment and partnerships being core to it, you'll start to really take shape to what I think is a high level of trust in the environment. And that is cultural influence in my mind, right? How do you influence a culture with security-minded leadership and practices so that the business can have it as a core piece of how they operate? And again, right, it goes back to this virtuous cycle. And the way that I've depicted it in the past is like you have a doom loop, right? And then you have like a flywheel, the Jim Collins kind of parallel there, right? And, I think that if you're going to have a successful Agile security program, you can't do it without having your stuff together, right, from a security practice perspective, but also, right, like understanding that the business may not be where you're at yet, right, and you need to meet them where they are, and you need to really work on breaking down the barriers. I think people come with a lot of like.
Well, there are real barriers, right? There's language barriers, there's prioritization barriers. You see your risk is different than me. We have different calibrations on things. Yeah, I think barriers is a perfectly legit thing to throw in there. Yeah,
for sure. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I resonate with that so much.
So, and James, are you referring to that article you posted on Better AppSec with the why Agile for application security works?
Oh, of course I am. Yeah, for some.
Perfect. I'm going to drop that in the chat for everybody then, because it's a good article and it does highlight those flywheel effects pretty. I like the flywheel effect, and I like the fact you also have a doom loop, right? And you can choose as a security leader what's that cultural tone you're going to strike. When you have momentum, in what momentum is this going? Because whatever you're doing, it will only ever increase, right? Positively or negatively.
Yeah, cultural change like that has to start from the top. I mean, I think there are many ingredients to change management in general. I mean, two very big ingredients I look at are that kind of behavioral modeling from the leadership side of things, and And then also from a process change perspective, setting up the right processes that involve your customers and help everyone win rather than just mandating a certain way of doing things. So on the leadership side of things, it's just really important to model the right behaviors around treating your security as a product in a way and collaborating, like you were saying before, meeting the business where they're at, really be playing that like diagnostic role in understanding what do you believe is a risk and what do I see as a risk and how do we agree on the right way of just describing that. I mean, who cares about categories and frameworks? I'm talking about like what is actually going to impact our business from succeeding the way that we want it to. Let's have that conversation and get on the same page about that. And maybe I have a perspective that's a bit more forward thinking, and we'll walk you towards that once you start seeing how we can help you burn that down over time. But like treating your business partners as customers, treating them with respect and empathy, and dealing with a lot of proactive like solutioning to them instead of just kind of throwing things in the air as problems. I mean, all of that is going to create so much more trust between you and those partners that is going to trickle down into then creating all of these ambassadors in your own security team who then treat their colleagues at their levels as partners and as peers in solving security at the ground level, because you have to play the ground game along with that top-down game. Yeah. So
I think can't mandate culture change.
So, modeling that behavior is so important because that feeds into that next side of things that I was mentioning around when you start implementing actual changes and driving new processes. If you have that foundation of trust and you pull, your infrastructure lead into a room and say, okay, this is a problem. We have overexposed IP ranges or whatever. We need to figure out what's the right way of actually managing this when we do changes in the future. That conversation is going to go so much more smoothly, and you're going to have so much more fun designing that solution so that everyone has a chance to now win when you need to operationalize that in the future. And it just becomes so much more of an enjoyable experience when you're building stuff with people you enjoy working with, backed by a shared foundation of trust and mutual respect. Like that's just table stakes, in my opinion.
Yeah,
but it's hard.
It's hard.
We have a whole industry that's based around we have specialized knowledge in a specialized world, a specialized world viewpoint, and we're going to bring a specialized solution, and no one can know. Like we've got 20 years of that baggage to shed off, and get rid of because it's been slowing us down. This idea that we're special. I don't know. What do you think, James?
Well, my thought there, right, is I made note of this earlier. The security program needs to, or the folks that define the security program, like who's in the security team, needs to have their culture, right, who they are as a team, kind of be well understood by one another, whether they write it down and say, like, here's our vision, here's our mission, here's how we operate, and come together as a team. Because if they're disjointed, right, and you have combativeness and you have, kind of like dissent amongst the team, that's going to ultimately trickle down into the partnerships that you deem as like critical to your success, and that's where you get into these doom loops, right? Like if you don't have your stuff together on that organizational and execution side, it's going to spill over to the culture you're trying to influence, and you have to have both. It's like symbiotic. Like there's this balance that needs to be really struck, and the other thing, right? Empowering an entire product and engineering team to own their own security destiny, right? You have to, as a security practitioner, I guess, not necessarily buy into that fully, right? But understand that your job can't be to block people, and that if you're going to scale yourself and security, it needs to be through others. So kind of decoupling yourself a little bit from the fact that you might be out of control of some of the security ownership piece, and you have to be okay with that, right? Like if you want to adopt this like mindset and this philosophy and this methodology, that the only way it's going to work is not necessarily fully removing yourself, but being the person that can step away from security and know that people beyond you inside the organization have security on their mind when they're making decisions.
Yeah, so I think this is really interesting, this idea that if we're going to be effective security leaders, is a sense of, we talk about like education and I often feel like that kind of begins and ends with like a phishing campaign, or begins and ends with like where we drone out for 45 minutes and tell everyone don't click the link or put two-factor on your accounts. Like, and that's what we think education is. But what I'm picking up from you two is that like when we talk about education, what we really should be talking about is what you mentioned there, James. This sense of you can own your own security destiny. As a security team, it is our job to build tools and services and process and patterns that you can implement. And here are the guardrails. So kind of educating them on like, here's the third rail, don't go touch that one. But the rest of them go feel to fly down the tracks as fast as you want. If you're going to handle these services, you're moving into the danger zone. So come talk to us and we'll work through the nuance with you. But like that is true security education, because at that point, when you leave the room, you've empowered your audience to make their own decisions, lead their own destiny, versus having to constantly check in with security on every PR they submit to GitHub.
One of my biggest pet peeves is when people complain about an outcome when they never set a clear expectation to begin with. Like that just breaks me so wrong, because if you don't advocate explicitly for what you expect of people, you have no right to complain that they behaved in a way that, you know, at odds with what you wanted. Like, and I think that applies heavily to security, where we rely so much on the decentralized decisions that are made by all of the teams and individuals kind of doing the day-to-day work. So, you know, it is incumbent upon this function to set very clear expectations about what is that third rail, what is the hard line that you cannot cross for certain things, and what is the kind of best practice or guideline for the most common use cases that these teams and individuals are going to be encountering. Until you can get there, it's really hard for you to hold people accountable because you aren't setting clear expectations. So, you should be wary of how much you are complaining until you set up that initial expectation, and how much you rag on the team for not following what you set out there. So I think that being super clear about what your expectations are is it's fundamental to getting any of that off the ground.
Yeah, it's almost like we have to say, if we go back to your phrase, treat the rest of the engineering organization, treat the rest of the company as a customer of a service that the security provides.
Yep, absolutely.
When I go to Netflix, I know what I'm getting, right? There is a product on the other side of this. I'm getting to watch a show. I'm not expecting to place an order, right? I'm a customer of a service and I know what I'm getting. And so it's part of security as well. It's just like, if we can set those expectations, set the tone, set the conversation. When you do this, this is what you get. Here's how we help. Here's what we do. Here's what we don't help. So I think that's an important thing. So I'd like to take that tangent and I'd like to just force and shoehorn a change in conversation here. Can we talk about your views, Henry, on how we successfully pivot a security program into treating it like a product? Like, how do we go from this project, I've implemented a thing or I've achieved a standard mentality, into these long-lived products with iterative change?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Thank you.
How do you train your security team to be product management? I think it fundamentally starts with agreeing on the problems you're trying to solve. And that's a thread we've already covered, I think, a bit. But in the security space, you actually have a few vectors of problems to contend with. You have your own understanding and the organization's understanding and appetite for risk. You need to have some notion of what are the threat vectors that we're going to be worrying about, and how are we in some way like aggregating them and kind of comparing them against each other, just come up with some sort of like rough prioritization of where we need to put our focus. So that can happen quantitatively. That could probably happen more often than not qualitatively, which is fine based on experience and best practices. But we need to have some perspective on what is that problem space we're trying to solve for. And then at the same time, we need to figure out kind of what James was describing before. What are the kind of integration points or touch points with all of the product and engineering players that we work with and we want to partner with to sort of inject and kind of align on in the moment as they are building and developing their products and services? How do we inject that risk management perspective as we go? So I think shifting to a product mindset pertains to how you shift to align to the product development process of your organization and the product development kind of principles of your organization. But it really has to do with agreeing on the problems you're trying to solve for and then putting forth the right plans to solve those problems. So I think that's step one, at least.
James, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I know that you I kind of made mention of this earlier, Connor, about not necessarily biasing on a standard or a framework. And I agree, right? Like, don't check the box, right? Necessarily. Well, what you do should innately check boxes, right? And I think that when it comes to this like product oriented mindset, especially for security and like delivering, security as a product or a service back to the organization, I think that we have this. I guess like as in the context of risk, right? We think one way, and we want other people to think very similarly about risk. And the only way you could really do that is give them kind of a forum or a framework for them to use so that they can rationalize a decision as it relates to their product, so that they can get a solid outcome, whether it's like, well, we don't actually implement the security control because we have something else, or we have another feature. Like basically like being able to make prioritization decisions about security so that they can own their security destiny, right? Like I think we try to influence as security practitioners their decisions forcefully sometimes. Like, we need this fixed before release, right? We see a lot of hard kind of blocking statements often because we're at in a situation where we're often looked at to control the risk, the cybersecurity risk, and I'm not doing a great job here, but like there's this point, right? And I was trying to describe it earlier, where you kind of have to hand that over to the people inside of product to make that decision, even if it's not the best decision from a security perspective. They're making that decision with the context of their product, and if you can give them the knobs and switches that you would use, right? At least they've put it through some framework so that they can rationalize that security decision, whatever it is. Well, okay, we need 2FA, or we need an additional function to do logging, whatever, right? Like, they are now aware that they need to do that. They've run through the exercise, and they can put it in their backlog and be like, we'll do that next sprint, right? And it doesn't disappear.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it, James. I think to expand upon that a little more, it's really about just giving your customers the tools they need to get their goals accomplished. I mean, that's kind of what it comes down to. And if you look at like the analogy to an infrastructure team, typically you'd want to see a product team and an engineering team to be very empowered to be able to stand up and provision their own infrastructure to meet whatever system design that they're contending with. In the similar way, you'd want the security function to provide the right preordained patterns and interfaces and monitoring and control frameworks on top of that meet the risk appetite of the feature team that's building XYZ system or service. So I think you need to just figure out what your derived from your your security organization's appetite for risk and the business appetite for risk. You can start putting together sort of your menu of services, and those services could be anything from like I said, to just just custom frameworks for how you monitor applications and systems, and you provide that as an offering for your customers as they're building their own features.
Yeah, I think it's something here as well. And if we continue to expand that, right, we're in this conversation, we're really centered on, this is how I framed the question. We're focusing on like the engineering community and shipping for them. But let's talk about our legal teams. Let's go talk about our risk team. Let's go talk about what our CEO wants. And if we really do put that customer mindset on, then achieving that PCI compliance or achieving that ISO 27001 or the SOC 2, it's not and should never be a validation of you as a security practitioner. You can be terrible at your job and pass a SOC 2. You can be great at your job and pass a SOC 2. It's just a reporting framework. Like, it's not that big a deal. You can same thing with ISO. Like, it doesn't matter. So it's not a validation of security. I think a lot of folks like, oh, I walked in this organization and I got them ISO compliant. I'm like, okay, did the company want that? Did they need that? If we were to walk into security leaders and say like, I see the blocker for the business, I can go tackle that. Now all of a sudden, like when we achieve a thing, it's not validation on us as leaders in a security program. It's the validation comes that we serve the customer, we serve the business, we helped achieve it. And so it's weird that we as an industry kind of have to like reorient ourselves. Like I hear people talking about it. Oh no, like security unlocks revenue through these things. And I'm like, yeah, why else are we like, that's one of the reasons that we're here. Another one is to reduce breach risk through reducing likelihood and impact of a breach. Another one is to make sure that we adhere to what our customers are requiring us through third-party contracts. Like we're here also to detect adversaries, respond quickly. Like these are things that we do for the business. So I think I got on a trail there, but basically there's this idea that if we do properly frame what every project and every effort we do as a customer, like somebody else gets an outcome here, it's not about us. This is kind of a good start. I think the conversation then starts to have a product tone to it. Like when you've got a service you offer someone with a customer, what's next? Like how do we then take it down a level and say these are some of the behaviors that we'd want to see manifesting in a team, if there is a prescription for that, or if every team's different, they may not be.
I can take a swing at that.
You want to go for that, Henry?
I mean, it really starts with helping your teams understand, do they understand who their customer is? Like what is their relationship to the broader organization? And do they share that perspective that you might have around who they primarily serve? So identifying those value streams, essentially, like you create something, it's valuable to who? It's not just valuable because you like doing it. It has some sort of tangible impact or outcome for someone else downstream. And figuring out where those most common intersection points are is really important for that team to understand who they need to start catering to. And from there, I think you start putting on your product management hat. You think about what does it look like for us to form a cohesive, trusting relationship with those customers to start really unpacking and identifying their problems as it pertains to what they're trying to achieve and how security fits into that conversation. There's a whole like product management practice around how you start unpacking and diagnosing and synthesizing the right customer problems to solve for. But I think that, until you start identifying those customers and building that feedback loop, you will probably not be meeting their needs as best as you could. So I would definitely start with the customer focus and then kind of refining the problem space from there.
Yeah, I like what you're saying there, Henry. I guess like to complement it in a way, it should never really be product versus security, but rather a trusting partnership where there's push and pull and everyone's on the same page working together.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it.
Yeah.
Well, you go for it, Henry.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Connor, I I also get what you're trying to get at in terms of how do we make this a bit more actionable for people, and if you're taking this mindset and what's the next step. I will say, like as we were talking about at the beginning, like Agile is not equal to Scrum, but Scrum is a really good foundational framework to start iteratively building capabilities designed to meet customer problems and take advantage of that rapid feedback loop. So that's really where, once you kind of go through those initial forming stages of identifying your customer, identifying those pain points, getting the team together around that common objective, that's really when you can start doing things like, okay, how do we want to iteratively start solving these problems and testing quickly whether or not it's meeting those needs? And that's really where you get into like the tactics around planning and delivery of kind of achieving those goals within that team. Does that help, I think?
Yeah, I like that. I think it's a nice concrete way to start, breaking down, starting these big waterfall every month we check in, but like these small iterative improvements. James, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that you have to ask, like engage with people and ask questions, and do it in two ways, right? Like both proactively and creating like a long-standing mechanism for people to provide feedback, whether it's anonymous or whatever it might be, but make that like well-known, well understood. Like if you have feedback and you want us to, take that into consideration, here's how you do that. And then, kind of have that out there for people to use. But the other one, the former, right, where you're actively kind of seeking feedback, go to people that you work with frequently and go to people that you don't work with frequently and ask them questions about like, what types of services work really well or could be better, right? Why don't you, in the event that somebody's not using, security services frequently, well, why is it? Trying to get to the core reason around why something is good or not so good or could be better, right? And it
It's
doesn't
amazing
even
what
need
we
to,
learn when we listen.
yeah, and it doesn't even need to be like, um, it doesn't even need to be like free form text, right? You can kind of give them a semi-qualitative scale. I forget the exact type of survey. There's a name for it, where you can say, like, how how frequently do you engage with the security team? Somewhat frequently,
Perhaps
frequently.
it's like an NPS score. Is that what you're
Yeah,
going for?
yeah, exactly.
Oh, I didn't mean to cut you off, dude. I was just
No, no, it's in a, I forget which book. Accelerate, I think, is the book. I was reading about it recently.
you have so many books on that shelf.
Uh,
So no, I think it's a really good points here. I like this idea. Like, we have a service, we have a service catalog. Here's my thoughts on this, and I'd like to hear both your opinions on this. So if we reorient ourselves as a service inside the organization, we give ourselves a vision, mission, strategy of what we're like, who we're serving, why we're doing it, and how we're going to get there in these big block and tackle ways. Then we say we have these services. Then it kind of gets into the metrics of the adoption metrics. Are people using the services? And like, if they are, like, adoption metrics is one of them. Another one is impact metrics. Is my service doing what I expect it to do? And then of course there's just operational metrics. Is there a health in that service? So, like, generally when we talk about metrics and security, we're talking about kind of like dwell time of the adversary or the severity of the vulnerability, or they're these very they're metrics that talk about like risk in a vacuum, or they talk about performance of that SOC analyst without the context of what the mission was. And I think we kind of get ourselves tripped up here when you take it down that level. We measure kind of the wrong things, or our measurements are ineffective at really telling that story. So what we might end up with is metrics that tell us about our operational efficiencies, are like, are we staffed properly in the SOC? But they're not really telling us, did we burn down the risk in and prevent these things from materializing, and that would have this knock-on impact, right? So I think there's this sense of, if we come back and we say we have service catalog, we have outcomes, impacts, and operational metrics. I think this is a critical piece that, if you don't think this through, will, if not immediately, pretty soon start to trip us up, because we will go in a different direction. What are your two thoughts on that?
I'll let Henry go on that one.
Oh man, that's expansive.
Well, I mean, I can.
Yeah, why don't you jump in? Yeah.
Well, yeah, I think, like, I have like one thought there, right? It's hard to measure trust, but it's easier, relatively speaking, to measuring trust to measure risk, right? Even on a semi-qualitative basis, right? You can start to quantify, to a certain degree, levels of risk in the environment, and not that the two are necessarily like correlated one to one, but if you, I don't know, like, it's hard to speak in these like macro terms, right? But like, if things are going well, right, you can see the risk level move, right, and ideally, like, in a direction that's either like it's plateaued, or you're measuring downward trends. That type of stuff. It's like cause and effect. High levels of trust will ideally, the outcome is reduced levels of risk in the environment. Ideally, right? Like, I think if I could like kind of like square it up here, that's how I would like to kind of communicate. From what we said at the onset of the conversation, right? Building that trust is important, because the outcome is reduced levels of risk, right? Or at least one that you can wrap your arms around and be like, what the heck's going on here? And have a not a well-oiled machine, but like a well-understood process to manage it.
Yeah.
If you don't have the trust, you're never going to get the change. Trust enables change. Change gets you risk reduction. That's what I'm hearing. So.
Let me see if I can expand on this a little bit. So there are a few areas I want to tackle with this. the first one is having relatively clear, if possible, kind of objectives that are defined with your leadership team, not by just your leadership team, but through the quarterly and annual goal setting process, to have some sort of target indicator of what are the most important dimensions of risk and delivery and performance and response times that we care about, and how do we want to measure those things, because those North Stars will necessarily form the kind of basis for how you start thinking about structuring all of your basically structuring all of the experiments that you want to run throughout the year. And I like to think about product development as a series of experiments, because that's essentially what it is. I mean, every time we say we're going to go do something in service of an objective, we don't actually know it's true. We want to form that hypothesis up front and set some pretty clear success criteria that would hopefully indicate that that is working or not, and disprove that. So in a security setting, I would want to see, for any particular initiative or project or program that we spin up, it should have some sort of measure of success that is predicated upon, like, what are we trying to prove out here by doing this thing? Like, how are we going to measure that by implementing this monitoring framework or this cloud security tool? What are we going to measure the material improvement of the security posture of our system or environment? And how are we going to demonstrate that that is necessarily a leading indicator of lower risk or less likelihood of a breach, or some sort of tie to those broader objectives that we're working towards with our leadership. So I would definitely say that structuring it that way helps you think about your incremental gains over time.
Yeah, but I like what you said there, and I just want to kind of circle back on that so everyone hears that there was a difference between, did your project succeed, did the tool implementation work, versus did it measurably reduce the risk in this area, right? So you can go, you had this idea of, like, we've got these metrics, these high-level metrics that we're going for. We do this thing, great, we're successful, but did it succeed in achieving that overall metric? Like, yes, you deployed the thing across all the endpoints. Yes, you removed the high config AWS, high risk AWS configurations. Cool, but did it actually move the needle? Was that, as you call it, a leading indicator in bringing down the risk? I think that's a really cool and important distinction.
Yep. Yeah, and that comes from, little plug here, that comes from a strong program management function to help guide your security leaders into structuring your thinking in that way, and making sure that you're advocating for some sort of business casing as part of your your project and program inception, that you have a good way of sharpening that, like, value hypothesis. It sounds like frameworky and whatever, but that's truly what it is. It's like, why do we think this is worth investing in? How are we going to know that we actually made anything out of this?
And for anyone who's listening, Henry puts a bunch of cool stuff on LinkedIn around this topic often. So go follow him, because you're going to get cool stuff in your feed about exactly this. So that's my plug. We only bring on the best guests here. The host, we can debate about that, but the guests are top notch. So dude, okay. So if we've got, like, this sense of, we've got our customers, we've got a mission, vision, strategy, we've got our measurement framework in place, what's kind of that next level of moving us towards treating security like a product? Is there something else that you want to make sure people walk away with and are implementing as they're going down this journey?
Yeah, it comes down to creating a safe place to fail, and continuously improving how to do all of those things together. So that is a very important facet of truly moving towards a more agile-oriented way of thinking, and a more kind of high-performing organization. Is you need to just make sure that people know that they can take risks that are going to not necessarily result in them losing their job if it goes poorly, but create enough structure for them to take those risks, to learn quickly, and also to reflect often. Like, it's important to note that, like, I would much rather a team be held accountable for learning from mistakes than to be accountable for making no mistakes. Because if you make no mistakes, like, that's just an impossible standard. So I think that it's just crucial that you also drive a kind of sense of continuous improvement and constant reflection on, if something went poorly, hold a postmortem. If something went really well, make sure that the team feels it and is recognized by the leadership team. all of those facets are just so important to just helping people feel safe and kind of empowered to continue to improve how they're doing all of these pieces.
I mean, those, you had a few things in there like communication feedback loops, right? Making sure there's retros, there's lessons being learned. We're not just failing and then failing again and failing again. Like this is the lessons learned component here. It's so interesting. Like I just noticed in myself. I completely agree. You need a safe place to fail. Like as a people leader, I'm like, yes, I agree. That is the tone. You should be able to experiment, quickly iterate. Personally, man, that like hit like a nerve inside of me. I'm like, no, we can't fail over here. You know, this is too important of a function to fail. But like, you're right. If we're iterating on experiments, then the failure is actually very small. The lessons we learned are really quick, and over the portfolio of changes with a significant uptick in security and resilience. Yeah, and I think that's kind of like an emotional thing. We have to kind of get people out of their own way, so that we can, proactively seek out a place for intelligent, safe failure. Yeah, I support that. That makes sense.
Yeah, I do too.
So, hey, James, you want to dive in? You had that idea on KPIs.
Yeah. So you asked a question about measurement, right? Like how do you know you're at the next level or whatever, right? And I think that it boils, in my mind, it boils down to two things, right? Like less work for developers, right? Reducing the overall burden of tax, so to speak, right? For them. So this kind of idea of like giving security to them for free, right? Giving them secure libraries and things that they can implement fairly trivially, and we could check for, that ensures consistency and high levels of security with high quality security as well. You want to make them look like heroes, right? So that's one part of it, and the other part of it is raising the bar for attackers, right? Well, the only way, so like that, the leading indicator is how much time did developers save, right? By using security that you can kind of give them for free, like common libraries, those guardrails you were mentioning earlier, Connor. And then the lagging indicator is saying, well, we know people attack. There's attackers all the time, right? Like, so going and looking at that attack traffic and saying, oh yeah, we have people looking for cross-site scripting literally all the time, right? And every time my API gets hit or my web site gets hit with these attacks, I'm doing good by not just the company but our customers. And I feel they could feel good that they've implemented security because they can see it in reality. Like people are trying to do bad things, right? And I think that's where you get the kind of the lightning bolt, right? And things come together.
Man, show, don't tell.
Yeah,
that's a big one, man. Demo like what's happening. Show people what's working. It's huge. Make it tangible.
Yeah.
Yep. That's a really classic idea. I mean, I think how many people have gone to the expense of creating all of these fancy dashboards inside their SOC or inside their, their web application firewall or wherever the control plane is for the data. And they're like, look, and then it just dies and it never comes back. And we never have a conversation about, is it working over time? And I think part of that is because we create something for ourselves as security. Hey, I want to see these metrics that mean nothing to anybody else. Engineers aren't bought in, so they're not checking it. I mean, yeah, it should be that you have a dashboard, let's just use that framework, where they can come in and see, I implemented this thing and all these automated scans went down. All these automated bot traffic, went down. Oh, my other service in the portfolio that I manage, I didn't implement it. And guess what? It's still hanging up nice and high. But showing people that also comes back to that only works if you're shipping in security, right? So if we're managing risk on a spreadsheet, it's really hard to show somebody something that's exciting. But if we can say, we had this problem, we solved it with this technology, come experience it in the day of the life of, and we'll give you a 30-minute demo on how this thing blocks an adversary. You're absolutely right. I think we got a lot more engagement with that. So there is this one thing, though, which I find is a difficult thing to overcome and wrap my head around. As we think about security practitioners, it's often said like our job, we're custodians of the risk of the organization. I've heard that said before. Or this mindset that we are really just trying to have a moment where we can say, here's all the risk we have in the org, using this big framework, and we're boiling it all down. I think we're going to come to the same answer here, but just a quick roundtable. Do we think that there is any structural barriers to, if we adopt an Agile, let's say we adopt Scrum as our methodology, we're constantly shipping iteratively, do we think that is opposed or prohibits us from having this larger risk view? Like, do they have to live in separate camps, or can the security leaders use both these tools at the same time?
I don't see why not, but I would love to unpack that more. James, what do you think?
Yeah, I don't have a crisp thought on it. I don't disagree with what you just said. I'm not sure if I have anything to add.
Where do you see it failing? I'm curious, Connor. Like, where do you see the fault lines?
Where I don't see. I think it works, and I think it works really well. Here's where I think people get hung up on. When we deal with risk, we come in like the beginning of the year. Here's our big year goal. Here's the big things that we're going to tackle. And because the security issues, the risk to the business is big, we feel the projects have to be big. Therefore, we embark on these 18-month implementations of a thing. And we kind of get stuck there, right? Or we try and solve all of this risk portfolio at the same time and try and like burn it all down incrementally. So the way I do it is I say, great, every quarter, what's the top of our risk? We're going to fight that. How many resources do we have to appropriately address the top risks? And then we focus, almost abandoning those other risks, right? We just focus, burn that one down. Next quarter, what's the most important to the business now, and we burn it down. So that's kind of how I do it. But I was just curious if you guys saw something I didn't.
Yeah. So, James, you go.
Yeah, I think that the one thing that I could add here, right, is OKRs, right? Like, or whatever format SMART goals, whatever, right? Like the way that you set your kind of strategy up for the year, maybe you change it quarterly or whatever. But objectives and then key results, right, as measured by. So like, what's the thing that you're trying to achieve, and how are you going to measure it, right? I think that's the thing that when I'm thinking about, like, all right, well, how am I going to deliver on a strategy? How I'm kind of like setting that up and communicating it.
Yeah, I would say that kind of tying, Connor, what you also said to what James described. When you say that at the beginning of the quarter, you kind of pick the highest, most burning risks that you want to burn down. I think that it's also important to make sure that that's aligned to the expectations across the organization of how you guys are managing risk. I assume that that's part of the process where you are kind of, that decision is the synthesis of many conversations with other functional leaders across the org to just understand where their heads are at, to kind of balance that prioritization call. I would say that, if you take the OKR view, what I like to do is look at, pick a time frame, quarterly, annually, whatever, like what can we do to better illustrate the kind of, if we have a pie chart, that's 100% of our capacity, how are we allocating that capacity against our top priorities? Is it all of that pie is going to number one, or are we finding a way to, adequately distribute, maybe 35% in the highest area, and then 20% to the next highest area, and then 15 and 10 and so on, so that you are still materially burning down these risks, but you're still constraining yourself and you're making it transparent, what you're choosing to prioritize and what you're not choosing to prioritize. So in that way, you can start to play with, the different levers of capacity to say, here's option A, we could go, hard on, risk number one, but we're necessarily going to be, leaving risks number 2 through 5 behind
on the table.
Yeah.
Dude, This is really, really good conversation. And we do need to bring it to a close. I mean, we've touched about so many things here about culture. We've talked about metrics in the right places, aligning, having this iterative space to fail so that we can have a larger strategy that succeeds. Guys, I just want to really thank you for your time today. Everyone who's listening, jump over to betterfsec.com. follow him on Medium. Make sure you're following Henry here on LinkedIn. So every day you're getting this content in your LinkedIn stream. And as always, hit the subscribe button, give us some love on this, because every single week, this is what we do, right? We're here to teach you how to win the infinite game of cybersecurity. So Henry, thank you for your time. James, thank you for jumping on the show.
Thank you.
Okay. Until next time, we'll see you next week on the Confident Fence podcast.